I knew I'd been gutted the second the room laughed. That cheap, fluorescent-lit conference room with stale coffee breath and someone's sad leftover Panera sandwich on the table. That's where it happened. The CEO, all gelled hair and ego, scanned the room during the all-hands and landed on me like he'd been rehearsing it. "If you're not happy here," he smirked, "the exit is right there." He even pointed. Like a damn game show host revealing door number 1. And everyone laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter's safer than silence when a higher-up takes aim. Even people I'd mentored. People I'd fought for. So I stood. No tantrum. No dramatics. Just closed my laptop, picked up my notebook, the same one I'd carried for 10 years, and walked out. I didn't make eye contact. Didn't blink. But I heard them go dead quiet behind me. Laughter snapping off like a mic being unplugged. By the way, before we go further, if you've ever had to swallow rage like it's lunch, hit that like button and subscribe. Seriously, 97% of you listen without clicking, but it actually helps this team keep stories like mine alive. Alright, back to the circus. The hallway was cold. Or maybe that was just the aftershock setting in. I didn't cry. Didn't scream. But my fingers were gripping that notebook like it was a steering wheel in a blizzard. I hit the elevator and pressed the button with a kind of focused rage that only comes when you've been humiliated in front of people who should have known better. Or at least shut up. That notebook? It wasn't some petty diary. It was a decade of patch jobs, vendor rot, compliance near misses, old project flows nobody else bothered to understand. It had the names of account managers who never answered emails, the suppliers who delivered 2 weeks early if you asked right, the exact order of operations that made our rickety systems look polished on paper. They never noticed who actually kept the boat from leaking. I didn't wear it on my sleeve. I wore it in silence, until someone else got the credit or a promotion. And here's the thing, I wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. I was tired. Tired of propping up executives who didn't know the difference between a root cause and a scapegoat. Tired of reworking the same quarterly presentation, just so some VP could feel like they contributed. Tired of being the net that caught every falling plate while they played ping pong in the break room. But I didn't leave because I was tired. I left because he pointed. Because in that moment, with all their eyes on me and that smug little half-smile curling on his face like this was some motivational TED Talk, he showed his cards. He thought I was disposable. Replaceable. A punchline with a pulse. And the second he said it, I mean the exact second, something in me clicked into place. Not snapped. Just clicked. Like an engine finally turning over after sitting idle too long. That's when I knew. I wasn't walking out of a job. I was walking into a plan. I didn't have some evil monologue waiting in the wings. No big speech. No Jerry Maguire who's coming with me moment. Just that notebook. Just 10 years of fingerprints on the unacknowledged scaffolding of a company too arrogant to notice how brittle it was. They thought I was done. But I had already started. Every boring detail I'd logged, every casual slight I'd swallowed, every ignored recommendation. Every coffee meeting where I kept my mouth shut while someone else pitched my work. It had all been stacking. Silently. Like snow on a roof. Until now. They gave me my out. Now I'd give them their ending. I camped out in the back corner of the coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment. The one with the flickering wall sconce and the uneven tables that always rocked unless you wedged a sugar packet under the leg. No Wi-Fi worth a damn, which made it perfect. The barista didn't ask questions after day 2, just poured my black coffee and nodded like we were co-conspirators in some long con. My notebook was cracked open like a crime scene folder. Ink bleeding into margins, highlighter scars, tabs from years ago still stubbornly hanging on like brittle flags. The smell of espresso and burnt toast did nothing to dull the low thrum behind my eyes. That low-frequency engine of anger that had settled into something colder. More useful. I wasn't mourning a job. I was calibrating a response. Page after page, I found the fingerprints I'd left on that company. Not the ones they applauded in town halls. The real ones. The buried fixes. The rerouted deliveries I'd orchestrated when supply chain almost buckled during that flood in 19. The email I sent at 3:07 a.m. on a Sunday that stopped legal from signing a nightmare contract with a shipping vendor that had pending lawsuits in 3 states. The junior analyst they almost fired because she caught a pricing discrepancy. I remember walking into procurement and taking the hit for her. They'd forgotten all of it. I hadn't. I had vendor lists with my own coded notes. Oscar equals always late unless Jen calls. Rowan equals delivers if you reference his dog. Alt V number 3 equals trust price. That last one showed up a lot. It was a quiet rule I'd followed for years. Go with the ones who show up, not the ones who sell better slides. And as I flipped through, I realized that phrase had been my compass without me knowing it. It was the seed. The playbook. Because here's what most execs never understand. They think loyalty is about ping-pong tables and culture surveys. It's not. It's about trust that lives in the boring stuff. In who gets paid on time. In who returns your call when the system crashes at 2 a.m. In who knows your kid's name because they've been working with you long enough to care. I opened my laptop. Not the company one. That got wiped the moment I walked out. This was my personal one. Quietly built over years. I had backups of backups. Not proprietary info. I'm not reckless. But metadata, timelines, receipts. I'd kept copies of vendor interactions, shipment delays, service resolutions. Things no one thought to save because they didn't see value in patterns. I did. There were patterns in everything. Especially failure. I pulled out a legal pad and wrote 2 columns. Assets and grudges. Under assets, I listed every vendor I trusted. Every contact who'd whispered frustrations over coffee. Every temp worker who'd been ghosted after solving impossible fires. Under grudges, I listed moments. Micro-humiliations that never got big enough to be HR issues but stacked up like splinters. The time I corrected a VP's math and he smirked. That's why we keep her around. The meeting where I wasn't introduced while my male counterpart was credited for my deck. The time our CEO replied to my strategic proposal with, "Let's have the guys take a pass at this." The guys. Plural. I was the only strategist on that project. I drew a line between both columns. That's where the plan would live. The company ran on predictability and ego. Predictability in that no one double-checked anything once it was approved. Ego in that they assumed nobody below a certain title had teeth. So I'd stay toothless in their minds. I'd be the ghost in the data. The forgotten variable in their pretty charts. I wasn't going to sabotage them. That would have been too loud. I was going to outfunction them. One vendor. One client. One call at a time. While they were busy remembering my resignation as a dramatic exit, I was going to build something quieter. Something that didn't have to scream to be heard. Something they'd only notice when it was too late to compete with. The trick is knowing which domino to tip. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but the one holding up the whole wobbly row behind it. That domino was Dumont Logistics. Not a sexy name. Mid-tier freight and routing outfit based 2 hours outside Cleveland. They didn't have a marketing department. Hell, I'm pretty sure their website still had a dancing GIF of a mailbox from 2007. But they controlled 38% of our routing flow for specialty components. Quietly, reliably, and with almost no oversight from the execs who only cared when the quarterly delivery chart was green. I'd met Louis Dumont once at a supplier mixer years ago. Broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, wore the same steel-toed boots to every event. Back then, we'd bonded over how stupidly the company was managing priority routing. Paying overnight rates for non-essential goods because a director forgot to click a calendar invite. Louis remembered that. So when I called and asked for a sit-down, he didn't hesitate. We met at a roadside diner with yellow booths and jukeboxes that still took coins. I didn't bother with small talk. I told him I had a modest proposal, and a very real reason to be taken seriously. "I want to invest," I said, sliding over a manila folder. Quietly. No board seat. No press release. "I want 5%, with the option for 7 at a 6-month checkpoint." He looked at the numbers. He looked at me. Then he said something that made me certain I'd picked the right domino. "They ever thank you for saving their ass after that mudslide in Kentucky?" I laughed once. Short and sharp. "They thought the software rerouted the trucks." He nodded. "Of course they did." That was the beginning. My severance wasn't huge, but I'd lived below my means for years. And I'd taken out a line of credit a month before I walked, just in case. Between the two, I bought in cleanly. Lewis and I set up a handshake clause before the lawyers papered it. If my referrals led to a 10% uptick in their non-primary routing over the next 2 quarters, he'd renegotiate exclusive tiers favoring channels I controlled. Not in name, in influence. I didn't want my fingerprints on anything. I wanted to stay the whisper behind the curtain. 2 weeks later, I took a drive to meet Jill Santos. If Dumond was the domino, Jill was the wind at its back. She'd been one of our account managers before being iced out during the last strategic realignment. Translation: her boss didn't like how often she pointed out that the emperor had no clothes. Her exit had been quiet, almost surgical. They thought she'd land somewhere small and burn out. She didn't. She pivoted to independent consulting and was now advising 3 of our largest regional clients. The kind of clients who never show up in the town halls but make up 20% of our volume. I found her running a workshop for a warehouse software rollout. Same clipped ponytail, same sharp gaze that could cut through pretense like a box cutter through shrink wrap. We sat in her car after, eating street tacos off the dashboard like old times. "They burned you too?" she asked, eyebrow arched. I shrugged. "They tried. Forgot I don't catch fire that easy." When I pitched her my idea, a network of quiet dependencies designed to reroute loyalty one decision at a time, she didn't flinch. Just wiped salsa off her chin and said, "I'm in. But I want double if this gets noisy." "It won't," I promised. "That's the point. No noise. Just absence. One day, they'll look up and realize their scaffolding's gone." We drew up a list of clients she could nudge. Not hard sells. Just questions. Have you ever had an issue with X delivery? Would you be open to testing Y route if the service level was better? The pain points already existed. I was just offering the aspirin. The first week, one client shifted 8% of their orders to the Dumond channel. Second week, another followed. Jill made introductions. I stayed invisible. But I watched the numbers climb like water behind a dam. The thing about buying in quietly is this: nobody sees the pressure building until the cracks start to show. And once they do, nobody asks who tapped the first nail. I spent 12 straight nights bathed in the cold light of my living room monitor, a space heater humming beside me and a half-dead spider plant drooping in silent judgment from the windowsill. The city outside slept. I dug. Buried beneath years of digital dust were the blueprints of their carelessness. Scattered across archived emails, outdated PDFs, internal reports they'd ignored, and a compliance memo I'd written myself that no one had ever acknowledged. I wasn't hacking. I wasn't even breaking NDAs. What I had were breadcrumbs, copies, personal drafts, meeting notes I'd taken on my own devices. Timelines I'd built to make sense of chaos, long before any of this started. Back then, I'd tracked it to stay sane. Now I tracked it to finish what they started. I mapped every audit they skipped. Every quarterly review where change requests were kicked down the road. The year we shelved the internal tooling upgrade, because someone didn't want to spend Q4 budgets on things that don't demo well. Every risk log entry I'd submitted, flagged, followed up on, then watched vanish into the abyss of executive blind spots. They hadn't just ignored red flags. They'd used them as coasters. But the real prize came at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. My eyes were bloodshot, my tea cold, my cat actively resenting me from the edge of the couch. I was combing through an old vendor renewal template when I saw a file name I didn't recognize. License_trigger_provision_v3_final. Buried in the old compliance folder I used to maintain before legal started streamlining oversight. I opened it, heart thudding low and heavy like thunder behind a wall. There it was. Section 6C, buried on page 12. If a key personnel listed under Appendix B is involuntarily terminated without documented cause or sufficient transition notice, minimum 30 business days, operational license stewardship shall revert to the secondary party listed in 6C. I blinked. Scrolled to Appendix B. My name. And in 6C, the secondary steward? An independent trust I'd set up 3 years prior. Back when I was managing disaster recovery scenarios, and realized how little the company actually understood the licenses they were signing off on. I'd suggested it as a precaution during a risk audit. Nobody pushed back. They were eager to offload liability, happy to sign whatever let them move on to the next shiny initiative. They'd fired me on a public Zoom call without notice, which meant, by their own paperwork, the operational rights to our core logistics framework now belonged to me. Not full ownership, but licensed stewardship, which, in this context, meant exclusive authority to approve third-party service integrations tied to the routing architecture. The same architecture Dumont now controlled a growing share of. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't cheer. I just sat back and stared at the screen, a small, sharp grin spreading across my face. They had handed me the key, and then slammed the door shut behind me, assuming I'd vanish. Instead, I'd been given the legal equivalent of an untraceable fuse. I printed everything, compiled it into a slim black binder. Not dramatic, just clean. Bullet points, source links, version histories, a cross-reference timeline showing exactly when I'd raised concerns and when they'd failed to act. If you laid it out plainly, as I did, the picture was damning. Not criminal, but operationally negligent. And in our line of work, that distinction didn't matter to the clients who read the fine print before renewing contracts. At dawn, I finally shut the notebook and flipped the binder closed. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like revelation. They'd built an empire out of shortcuts and assumptions. And I had just documented every week joint with timestamps. All that was left was to let wait do what it always does to rot. I didn't launch a new brand. Didn't unveil some flashy startup with a Latin name and a PR rollout. That's not how trust works in the trenches. You don't need billboards to win hearts, just a quiet solution when the pain hits hardest. And I knew where the pain was already festering, because I used to be the one fielding their desperate late-night emails when our delivery windows broke down, when executive promises outpaced operational reality. I started with 4 names. Clients I'd worked with personally. People who had seen me solve problems without ever asking for credit. My emails weren't dramatic, just quiet notes from an industry friend who'd heard they'd had a rough Q1 with routing delays, fluctuating costs, unexpected friction. That's what I called it. Friction. Polite. Non-threatening. But it landed. Because everyone in this business has more friction than they care to admit, and no one likes feeling like the last to know about a better way. The first lunch was with Craig, senior operations at a medical components distributor outside Columbus. We met at a steakhouse he liked because the waiters never interrupted during venting. He walked in fuming about another misrouted shipment that cost them 2 weekends of overtime. I let him talk, let the frustration settle. Then I slid a folder across the table. Hypothetical solution, I said. Faster. Cheaper. Built around reliability instead of slide decks. He didn't even blink. How hypothetical? Let's say it's live. Let's say your next order could be routed through a vendor who doesn't miss Tuesday windows. Craig smirked. Let's say I'm interested. That's how it went over and over. I didn't cold pitch. I didn't promise revolutions. I offered aspirin, direct, silent, effective relief. Jill helped amplify the message. A few nudges here, a few whispered confirmations there. The power of suggestion wrapped in competence. Clients started shifting small percentages at first. Trial runs. Test shipments. They weren't pulling away because of a grand betrayal. They were peeling off like people exiting a malfunctioning escalator. One foot out of habit, the other out of survival instinct. The beauty of it? It didn't look coordinated. From the outside, it looked like normal market behavior. A few clients adjusting vendors. Some routing shifts. A couple of emails expressing concerns about service levels. But internally, I knew how fragile the load balancing really was. I knew what even a 6% deviation in outbound logistics could do to forecasting. One client emailed me after a successful test run and wrote, "Funny how your way just works." I didn't respond with a wink or a thank you. I just sent her a second proposal. More efficient. Slightly scaled. Easier integration. By month's end, 7 clients had shifted some portion of their routing through Dumont's lines. All under the radar. All without PR fanfare. No one posted about it on LinkedIn. That was the point. This was death by quiet preference. Back at HQ, They wouldn't have noticed anything yet. Not unless they were watching the long-tail metrics. But I knew the signs. Internal dashboards would start showing minor dips. Increased delivery variance in Region 2. Unusual vendor overlap in Q3 flow models. Customer feedback shift on service consistency. Nothing that triggered alarms. Just enough to start pinging analysts who didn't have answers. This wasn't sabotage. It was gravity. And I had just begun to tilt the field. It started with a missed delivery window. Not by accident, by recalibration. Dumont Logistics adjusted a single Tuesday route from firm to flex for a client that had quietly rerouted part of their business through my channel. To most outsiders, it looked like a clerical shuffle. But inside the old company, it pinged red on their internal SLAs. One of those metrics they prided themselves on never breaking. The procurement head, Dan Riggs, was the first to reach out. He'd always been the type who wore cufflinks to Zoom calls and treated supplier relations like a cocktail party. Smiles, surface charm, no depth. He scheduled a friendly alignment touchpoint with Louis Dumont. But Louis didn't take the call alone. I was on the line, muted, video off, listening through a clean pass-through on a second laptop at Louis's desk. Not spying, just silent. I wanted to hear the exact tone of the unraveling. Louis, Dan began, that fake chuckle warmth already creeping in. Not sure what's going on, but we've had a few disruptions lately. Nothing serious, of course, just irregularities. Louis cleared his throat. You mean the shift in Zone 3? Well, that one's getting attention. And the 9% bump on expedited routing rates. Louis leaned back, folding his hands. We revised the schedule based on forecast load. And we adjusted rates due to regional fuel increases. Same thing your team used to cite during price talks, if I recall. Dan laughed too loud. Yeah, of course. Of course. It's just, our CFO's asking questions. Louis smiled. Maybe your CFO should check who's still authorized to approve routing changes. Dead silence. And that's when I slid the clause across the desk. A clean PDF, Section 6C, printed with highlighting, stapled to a timeline showing the exact termination date they'd fired me. Without notice, without cause, without the 30-day transition required. Dan's voice went brittle. That clause was from 3 years ago. Still active, Louis replied. Still signed. And per the vendor stewardship terms. License control transferred to the secondary steward. She has exclusive operational veto. Me, I said, unmuting. Silence again. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply said, you voided your own integration privileges when you fired me on a live meeting call with no paperwork. I've exercised that control for the sake of continuity. So far, I've been gentle. Dan started stammering. Something about escalation paths, possible misunderstanding, their legal team needing a look. I cut him off. Feel free to have them read the memo I sent your general counsel this morning. Timestamps included. We ended the call cleanly. No threats. No raised voices. Just a digital paper trail and a company-sized migraine. That was the first squeeze. Over the next 2 weeks, small changes multiplied. Preferred scheduling windows were quietly deprioritized. Inventory buffer zones began to shrink. Automated delivery confirmations stopped syncing with their internal dashboards. Nothing illegal, just a change in data formatting that required manual adjustment. Their analysts were forced to rerun reports. Deadlines stretched. Customers got less responsive. One account manager sent a Slack to her team asking why clients are suddenly cagey on renewals. Another pinged procurement with any idea what's happening with the Tier 2 routes? I didn't answer. I watched. And somewhere in the midst of that chaos, their risk model tripped. How do I know? Because a friend from inside forwarded me an internal alert memo. Operational exposure scenario modeling, V2 urgent. It was filled with red boxes. Vendor risk, client churn potential, loss of service redundancy. My name wasn't in it. But my fingerprints were all over the instability. And all they could do was react. Panic doesn't hit like thunder. It hits like a slow exhale turning into a gasp. They thought the pain was temporary. A dip. A market wobble. But this wasn't a blip. It was a blueprint. Drawn years ago. annotated in margins. Now being implemented. One clause, one choke point, one failed assumption at a time. The piece appeared in Midwest Logistics Bulletin, 3 paragraphs buried between a diesel emissions compliance update and a glowing profile of a new rail freight startup in Indiana. It wasn't sensational. No one was named. But anyone who knew the landscape knew exactly who it was about. Multiple sources report irregularities in routing consistency and client retention at a major Ohio-based fulfillment firm. It began. Disruptions appear to stem from unresolved vendor coordination issues and recent internal restructuring that left key operational roles vacant without clear transitions. No logo. No sale quote. No legal threats. Just a quiet, clinical autopsy in progress. I didn't write it. I didn't have to. I'd just met the editor for coffee 4 weeks earlier, dropped a few crumbs, then left her to follow the scent. When you give smart people partial truths with just enough spice to verify independently, they dig. It's instinct. And once she hit the clause 6C, transfer buried in public vendor filings, she knew she'd found her headline, without ever having to print a name. The leak didn't explode. It festered. 2 days after the piece ran, I started getting texts from old vendor contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. Hey, are you still working with Acme Freight? We're hearing some weird stuff. You seeing late pays out of North Hub? I'm getting nervous. Got anyone else who needs capacity? They weren't panicking. Not yet. But they were circling their wagons. Small vendors can't afford instability. They move quick when a storm's in the forecast, even if it hasn't started raining. I watch LinkedIn too. Not for posts, for silences. The company's marketing team usually pushed out some puff piece every week. Proud to partner with. Another milestone hit. Celebrating excellence in Q3. But now? Nothing. 3 weeks of radio silence. Not even a recycled quote from the CEO's TEDx talk about grit culture. Meanwhile, procurement side groups started buzzing. Not public threads, private DMs. A screenshot made its way to me from a vendor Slack room. Someone asking, has anyone else seen delays from D&M? Another replied, our load confirmations are bouncing. A third just said, Clause X? Clause X. I blinked when I saw it. That wasn't a real clause, not in our contracts. That was internal shorthand. A nickname someone had given to the vendor license provision after I explained it in a training 3 years ago. It's the clause no one thinks matters until it does. They'd laughed. Written Clause X on the whiteboard like it was a joke. Now they were using it in whispered messages. Like it was the monster under their bed. And I wasn't even touching the rest yet. No client data. No NDAs broken. No press statements. Just physics. Let enough support beams rot quietly, and people noticed the creak before the crash. A partner finance firm downgraded the company's credit risk from stable to moderate exposure. A quiet flag in the backend systems, but enough to trigger holdbacks on certain supply terms. I didn't trigger it. I just didn't stop it. Back inside, I imagined the Monday meetings getting colder. Forecasts sliding. Legal scrambling to understand how a forgotten clause and a few shifted vendors could have created this ripple. I knew someone was pulling together a task force, probably with a title like Continuity Stabilization or Vendor Realignment Phase 2. I could see the spreadsheets, smell the panic under all that deodorized PR comm. But I didn't post, didn't gloat, just sat at my window that night with a notebook in my lap and watched the city lights twitch like servers under load. The funny thing about silence is, once people realize it's not accidental, it gets louder than anything else. They were finally hearing it. They held the emergency meeting on a Sunday. I know because one of the junior attorneys still had her church shoes on in the conference room photo that leaked into my inbox that night. Blurred faces. A single line in the subject. Special session, immediate resolution agenda. The CEO sat at the head of the table, but he wasn't leaning back like usual. No crossed arms. No smug posture. Just a hand over his mouth. And the kind of stare that comes after someone reads a number so big it turns into noise. The agenda had been simple on paper. Identify the cause of the vendor disruptions, assess the exposure risk, and coordinate strategic reintegration. But every attempt to fix things only tightened the noose. They'd tried renegotiating with Dumont Logistics. Louis didn't budge. Not without me. They'd floated transition compensation to recover their client accounts. But those clients weren't leaving over money. They were leaving because their trust had already shifted somewhere else. Then came the legal flailing. I knew the playbook: threaten breach, allude to litigation, rattle the saber just loud enough to scare someone into blinking. They sent a cease and desist to Dumont. He forwarded it to me with a single word: cute. Their general counsel tried reaching out directly. A woman who'd once forgotten my name twice during a project I saved from regulatory fines. She opened with, "Let's explore some mutually beneficial options." I closed with, "Let's start with clause enforcement and proceed backward from there." By Tuesday, they'd pulled 3 outside legal firms into rotation. None could find a clean way around the vendor license transfer. Every document I'd touched had been reviewed, signed, archived. The very laziness they'd indulged for years, approving things without reading, trusting process over precision, had locked them in. It wasn't just me who'd built the trap. They built it. I just remembered where the doors were. Inside the company, departments began operating like disconnected organs. Procurement started rerouting blindly, creating bottlenecks. Client services was flooded with inquiries they couldn't satisfy. Sales started offering discounts they couldn't fulfill. And legal? Legal was just begging everyone to stop emailing things that would end up in discovery. The CEO finally snapped during a call with one of our largest regional clients. The client had asked point blank, "Can you guarantee we won't see another missed shipment next quarter?" The CEO froze, then stuttered something about evolving partnerships. That client sent a termination letter 48 hours later. Another domino down. Back in my apartment, I watched all this unfold in quiet detachment. Not joy, not rage, just stillness. I had my coffee. I had my notebook. I had the numbers. I'd become part scientist, part mortician, watching the autopsy of a legacy that died not from malice, but from rot. They didn't lose because I sabotaged them. They lost because I didn't stop them from sabotaging themselves. And yet, as the boardrooms filled with noise and the PR drafts piled up and the credit lines constricted like lungs in a burning room, I felt no compulsion to dance. No thirst for public humiliation. I didn't want to go viral. I didn't want the schadenfreude. What I wanted was certainty. So I drafted one final document. Not a lawsuit. Not a headline. A stipulation, clean, clinical, legally sound. 3 points. 1 transfer. 1 correction. 1 condition. I printed it, signed it, and placed it in a black envelope. And then I waited. Not for applause. Not for blood. Just for the knock on the door I knew was coming. Because they weren't fighting to survive anymore. They were negotiating to disappear quietly. The board didn't meet in their usual conference room. This wasn't a meeting for status updates or platitudes. They chose a hotel suite downtown. The kind with blackout curtains and bottled water that costs $12. The kind of place where things get signed and buried. I arrived early, carrying only the black envelope. No laptop. No binder. Just the terms. There were 6 of them. 3 in tailored suits trying not to sweat, 2 legal advisors reading expressions more than documents, and 1 woman, a newer board member, younger, quiet, watching everything like a hawk that hadn't decided whether to strike or fly. I placed the envelope on the center of the table. "This is a stipulation," I said. "It contains 3 items. It's not a threat. It's a way out." No one reached for it. Not yet. The company you're trying to salvage has already lost its structural advantage. You can fight me. You might win pieces. But in doing so, you'll trigger every clause you forgot existed, every partner I now influence, and every client you no longer fully control. I let the words hang. No theatrics. Just math spoken out loud. The stipulation is this. First, the company's legacy routing architecture and its dependent vendor chains are to be transferred into a neutral operations trust. Call it stewardship, call it surrender. I don't care about the name, just the function. I'll manage it. Quietly. Effectively. Without brand. One of the lawyers opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. Second, a public correction. You don't name me. You don't name anyone. But you issue a statement acknowledging your transition missteps, thank the unnamed architects of your former systems, and announce your decision to step away from certain market sectors. And third? The woman asked. I looked at her. She hadn't blinked since I entered. Non-disparagement, I said. Mutual. You never mention me. I never mention you. You walk away with what dignity you have left. I walk away with what you thought didn't matter. The CEO wasn't in the room. He'd been advised to refrain from direct engagement. Probably sitting in a lawyer's office somewhere trying to reverse engineer how a woman he once dismissed with a joke now held the keys to his crumbling kingdom. They read the papers. Slowly. Carefully. The legal counsel's pen tapped 5 times on the table. A nervous tick I remembered from the first time we'd met during a contract risk workshop I ran 3 years ago. He hadn't listened then. He was listening now. They signed. No handshakes. No thanks. Just the quiet sound of agreement born not from respect, but from surrender. I left before the ink dried. Outside, the sky was the color of dishwater, and the sidewalk smelled like rain had flirted with the city but never committed. I didn't look back. Didn't need to. The work was done. I didn't win a war. I outlived a system. And in doing so, I carved out something better than revenge, leverage. Not for me to exploit. For me to protect. The vendors who still answered emails at midnight. The analysts who'd caught my errors before they cost us millions. The partners who'd always done right by the work, even when no one noticed. They'd get stability. The ones who laughed, they'd get silence. And silence, as it turns out, is heavier than any courtroom verdict. Back in my apartment, I placed the notebook in a drawer. I didn't burn it. Didn't frame it. Just filed it away like any other tool that had done its job. Exit doors, I realized, are for people who never built a plan. I didn't exit. I rearranged the industry behind the curtain. And then I walked away, not empty, not triumphant, just free.